Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So there's a term that's just sort of come about that I've never heard about before, that seems to be all the rage lately, called quiet quitting. And I wanted to check in with Victoria Pelletier, who is a senior executive, a keynote speaker, an author, a passionate diversity inclusion leader, a networking champion, a board director, a C-suite transformation leader. My God, just you do everything. And also someone who has written about and spoken about quiet quitting and wants to join us today to tell us a little bit about what it's all about. So, Victoria, welcome to the show, and tell me, please, what the heck is quiet quitting, and why has it become like the thing that we're all talking about?
Well, thanks, Brian, for having me back. I enjoy being here. And I love and I hate this right now. I hate the phrase quiet quitting. But I love that there's much more of a conversation around this, and a lot of it's been driven by the last couple of years and the experience we've had. So what quiet quitting is, or essentially it's really just boundaries that are being created by employees to say, this is what I have been hired for. Here's the responsibilities in which, I've been asked to deliver the, success or outcomes, but I'm not prepared to do it at all costs. I'm not prepared to do it outside of my regular work hours, and I'm not prepared to do it in toxic work environments. That is what quiet quitting means, and shouldn't actually be equated with quitting at all, but rather a lot more confidence in people standing up for the purpose and values and the reason they want to be at work and the type of culture and environment they want to work in.
Why has this become such a term just in the last, what is it, month or so that I've heard about it?
Yeah, well, it stems out of the Great Resignation, and talking about this massive turnover that we're seeing in the workforce for many of the same reasons. And I think quiet quitting is being coined as really what I'm going to say is the precursor to the resignation. So people making choices. Not everyone's unhappy, though, I will state that. So it doesn't mean that people are necessarily going to resign, but in many cases it is the precursor. People saying, that's it, I'm out. I'm not prepared to work 60 to 80 hours a week to get it all done at all costs. I'm going to be really mindful around my, personal, physical, mental, well-being and the needs of my family. And so I think that it stems from that, seeing and attempting to predict where turnover is going to exist and the reasons why. And so someone's come up with this great media term, quite frankly, I believe, of quiet quitting.
And is this something you think just stemmed because of COVID and we were all staying at home and we got tired of the commute or what?
Uh, I think some of it is a result of that, quite frankly. But I mean, not even just the pandemic. The reality is, I think whether it's just the discrimination and the focus on diversity and inclusion, I think more and more both consumers and certainly employees are making decisions over who do they want to buy from, and what leaders and organizations do they want to work for. And that means, yes, because we've recognized that for the last 2 years, we could work from anywhere, employees demanding to continue to do so, not without still expectations around their performance and the outcomes they need to deliver for their organizations and their customers or clients, but recognizing that we can do it, that we don't need to have someone looking over our shoulder to attempt to talk about our productivity because we can deliver. But it's also around the just an evaluation of what's really important to us. And so that is working for the type of people who are going to support our personal development, who are going to give us much more flexibility in how we get work done, and recognizing that, it's about life centricity, that there's more than, just the paycheck for which we're, earning, to why we get up and look forward to the day each day.
Now, at the same time, there seems to be this trend or this desire for a lot of CEOs to have people come back to work. There was a whole section in the New York Times this past weekend about how CEO after CEO was not sure if people are actually working when they're at home, and particularly wanting to know where they are, and actually sending out change of address requests. If you're not at home, are you in Timbuktu or on some beach somewhere and trying to pretend that you're remote working? And so there seems to be this lack of trust on behalf of some CEOs that people are actually being productive and working when they're not in their office, in their cubicle, punching a clock.
Yeah, you're right, Brian. And actually, what there is a rise of right now also is monitoring of people working from home. And so those are things, when you talk about lack of trust, they're measuring keystrokes. They're measuring the amount of time to complete certain activities or emails, or if you have social collaboration technology such as Teams or Slack, et cetera, viewing when people are idle and not physically moving around. So, I mean, people are defeating it left, right, and center, and, getting, mice that, that move every once in a while to prevent them from moving in, into idle status. But that for me is where, and this is where quiet, quitting, or the great resignation that's happening is this confluence of, employees just recognizing they want to do really good work and things that are purposeful to them, but also in cultures where they are trusted. But with trust comes clarity. And that means there's, the businesses and the leaders specifically need to be exceptionally clear on what strong performance looks like and about what outcomes and deliverables are expected of employees. I might have even shared this with you in the past and other times we've spoken. I have this philosophy long before the pandemic with my team. There are no schedules, there's just deliverables. So you've never had to ask me for permission to take an aged parent to a doctor's appointment or leave early to take a child to a soccer or baseball or hockey game. You don't. I just have expectations that you're going to get the work done. And I think that is now at the forefront of what everyone wants, and trust and compassion comes with that.
We're having an interesting conversation about quiet quitting tonight with Victoria Pelletier, the Chief Transformation Officer for Accenture. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Victoria in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Victoria Pelletier, who is the Chief Transformation Officer for Accenture. And we're talking about this term that I hadn't frankly heard about until just a couple of weeks ago, called quiet quitting. And Victoria has told us a little bit about where it's come from and what its rationale is. And so, Victoria, is this something that all the workforce is feeling, or do you think it's only millennials or people that are young, just entering the workforce, where this desire for, really greater trust within the work environment? Who's experiencing this?
I think we're seeing it multi-generationally, but for different reasons. Now, the one thing I will state, so although I said I hate the phrase quiet quitting, there has been what is referred to as strategic incompetence for a very long time.
Strategic incompetence.
And those are employees, although we can think about it in some of our personal relationships. I think of like spouses where one of them might claim to not know how to do the laundry very well and shrink clothes or make them turn pink, but in an attempt to get out of doing certain work or activities in future. And so bring that into the workplace. That's the strategic incompetence. There's people who will claim to or perform poorly doing certain work activities because they don't enjoy it and they want to see it move to other individuals. So I think the quiet quitting comes a little bit out of this sadly very poor way of handling performance by some employees.
Right.
Generationally, I think we're seeing it on a multitude of fronts. So I think there's the older workforce is done much more of an evaluation of their ability to work in a very different way over the last couple of years and are challenging going back to the way things were. What was the future of work a couple of years ago is now. It's now. There's no future. It's here. Right. So I think there's them pushing back to say, I have proven that I can deliver without you physically seeing my butt sitting in a seat. Right. And so they're challenging and pushing that way, and also recognizing they were much more generally productive. And so you'll see them pushing back in this quiet quitting era more because they've demonstrated capability, and also the recognition that there was a lot more safety and health focus for many of that generation, as they had older parents or family members who, contracted COVID, et cetera. And then when you look at the younger generation, quite frankly, I think we would have seen much more of this kind of, and we were seeing this in the workplace, right? So younger employees who wanted to work for organizations that, operated with great purpose and had great values, and that included responsible human-centered leadership, which means care and compassion, and again, creating greater flexibility. But also there much more recognition from the younger generation, and I have two of those in the workforce who, do much more and have other passions outside of life, and maybe you can bring them together. And there's this kind of paradox with them that exists between how do you show up and do work that you enjoy, that is, gives back potentially to a world in which that you're aligned with, but also the paradox that at times you're actually going to still prioritize yourself over some of those. And how do you work in an organization and environment that accounts and supports for that?
Now, you're the chief transformation officer for a consulting firm, Accenture. The sense that I have is that some CEOs just wouldn't agree with what you've been saying, and they're, monitoring keystrokes, and they're not trusting that their employees are productive when they're either at home or working remotely, and they want them back in cubicles. And we've seen this with different banks in New York that are saying if you don't work for 40 hours a week in this office, you're not going to get paid for 40 hours worth of work. So how do you deal with those CEOs? Like if they call you in for some advice, what do you say to them? Start trusting your employees or what?
Well, interestingly, and slight correction, I'm not the chief transformation officer for Accenture. What I do, and I work in a part of Accenture that works with CEOs and board members on transformation within their organizations. And the reason for creating it is we were always delivering this work, whether it's a merger or an acquisition, a digital transformation, but recognition that there's this intersection of the transformation that's occurring in their organizations with leadership and culture, and personally their involvement as a C-suite or their direct reports, and the board's engagement in those being successful. And so when I'm talking to CEOs or other executives around the need to challenge their thinking, challenge their level of engagement, and the need for them to demonstrably lead from the top, not everyone's comfortable with that. As you said, you think of, Jamie Dimon early, and when people were starting to return, to the workforce, head of Bank of America said, everyone's got to be back in, and then realized everyone's kind of reeling from this. And you see some of them starting to back away from it, although certainly didn't stop Elon Musk from also claiming that Tesla employees needed to physically be back in the office, or they were going to, be basically offering their resignation. What we're seeing is, it's a lot of coaching. There's a lot of data. There's a lot of bringing the qualitative data, to the forefront, not just the quantitative in terms of how quickly people are exiting their organizations, but in exit interviews, in engagement surveys, the qualitative pieces that are coming out of that. And so a lot of my conversation has been around education, but also challenging their thinking. I can tell you, Brian, I said to one CEO, I said, forgive me for saying what I'm going to say next, but I am quite confident you did not hire us to tell you what you want to hear. And then I went on to, give him, be radically candid. And a big part of it is that right now, challenge old ways of working are not going to, create, new market share, higher employee engagement, and greater revenue and profitability.
Is this because unemployment is so low, and so therefore jobs are plentiful, and so therefore people can choose and leave jobs and go to other jobs? If unemployment was 8, 9, 10%, would it be a different environment if jobs were plentiful and we were all sort of worried about where the next job opportunity is going to come from?
Possibly. I think I've started to see with my focus over the last number of years and working with clients, it's very much shifted to this. There was, I talked about future of work. We've been talking about it for close to a decade, and that, phrase has been used for a couple of years prior to the pandemic. So it's been coming. But I think we're at the precipice now because of the pandemic, one, and two, because unemployment levels are at record lows. And so everyone's fine. Employers are asking their employees to do more right now because there is a workforce challenge.
Yeah.
And there's a gap, and they still have customers or clients with expectations, and the patience level for consumers, I think you and I would probably agree, like, is shortened. We can no longer continue to say, oh, I'm going to wait for, whether it's at a restaurant, I'm going to wait for longer service, because at some point, like, our patience is run out. And so there's an ask of employees. And so I think employers are being forced to have these conversations and to be challenged boldly, because it's the only way, to start to do things differently and, attempt to get back to pre-pandemic levels, whether it's service, productivity, et cetera.
Is this an idealistic, almost sort of woke attitude that only is appropriate on the coasts? Or is it really something that's across the nation? And what about, is this just really a white collar, professional kind of issue, and you don't have it in factories, you don't have it in service jobs? Tell me how prevalent you think this quiet quitting attitude is.
I think it's very prevalent, extremely so in white collar type jobs, yes. But the reality is we're seeing it pretty significantly in more blue collar type roles as well. And again, there's a plethora of jobs for everyone to move into. And so I spend a lot of time actually right now focused around travel and hospitality clients. And so you think of the people that are serving us, the people are greeting us as we return to travel, entry-level roles that might not always have been seen as a destination and from a career perspective, and maybe a starting point or an interim place. Even in those, as I'm talking to CHROs and other business leaders of, those types of organizations, they're having the same conversation, right? So someone who's cleaning our hotel rooms for us are still expecting significant level of respect, again, working and being respected by their leadership, and having a great place and environment for them to show up at. So I do think you'll see varying levels of conversations and ability for people to, or perceived ability for people to hop to different places. But the reality is it's in every coast, it's in every industry, and it's at every level of an organization.
I'm on the west coast of Canada right now, and it was fascinating that the baggage handlers, the ticket takers, everyone in travel was understaffed. The hotel that I tried to stay in was only at 50% occupancy, but that's not because of a lack of demand. The demand was huge. That's just because they couldn't get the employees. And they were actually charging $800 a night for the room rate, so that they were actually being able to make more money, even though they were only half open. And the restaurants and the ferry services in British Columbia are all being challenged, struggling to get the workforce. And I think part of it is that people laid off too many people during COVID because of the diminishment of travel, and didn't hire them back and didn't train them as quickly as they needed to. But it seems that in the hospitality business, in the travel business, there just aren't enough people willing to do some of those jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at in the US, where I'm currently living and working, you look at immigration is, at the lowest it's been in decades as well. And so typically you would have seen a lot of newer immigrants into the country moving into those types of roles. So it's this, you double-edged sword between extremely low unemployment rate and low immigration levels as well. When you speak specifically around some of those industries and types of workers, I shudder to think of what it's going to look like when you think of the upcoming holiday season at the end of the year, when we think of our Amazon or whatever online packages being delivered, or FedEx and UPS drivers, and so a lot more care and compassion and kindness we need to have. But those are going to be other industries we're going to expect that there's going to be some challenges. And as I'm talking to leaders as well, like, this isn't as I mentioned, talking to a CHRO recently at a hotel, and I said, I think, this isn't a challenge purely for HR to solve, right? There's also this joint work that needs to be done with marketing to build back some brand awareness and a bit of a safety, if you will, or perceived safety, for people to go back into an industry that was one of the first to lay off people when the pandemic hit.
When we started our conversation today, you used the term toxic work environment. What's a toxic work environment?
It's it can mean many things, and I'm sad to say, Brian, I've worked in a few of those and made some decisions to exit because of that. And that can be things like this massive discrepancy between, what the organization states its purpose and success looks like. In fact, there was an amazing, I think it was a Harvard Business Review article that just came out and said there's this mismatch between the stakeholders and looking at ESG, environmental, sustainability, governance type objectives with shareholder requirements. And so a toxic environment can be things like, stated goals or objectives that are one thing, but clearly measurements that drive behavior, attitudes, and sometimes language and again, really poor behavior with others. It can be a lack of transparency for leadership to employees when decisions are made. I'm a big fan of providing significant context behind why we are making the changes that we're making. It's not apparent to all of our frontline staff who don't deal with some of the challenges that, the top of organizations might have to deal with strategically. It can also be not living, and I hold leadership broadly accountable to this. Again, it's not the HR department's problem singularly to solve around, leading the way we want to be led, and creating a kind of environment where people can feel like they can bring their authentic selves to the workplace. They've got a great sense of belonging. They feel that there's this human-centric approach to life that we all live and show up. We can't put everything at the door when we show up. We're going through a divorce, someone passed away, and then with the work that we do. And so toxic environment can be, people who don't understand or respect that. It can be this mismatch, as I said, between expectations and performance and measures and how people get compensated. Or it can just be, people who've risen through the ranks because they were very successful at one thing, but that didn't make them very successful leaders.
What you describe about the workplace of the future, or the job of the future, sounds really idealistic. It sounds like it's the perfect place to work and be, but is it really possible when you've got a whole bunch of CEOs and leaders that grew up a generation ago and found that some other styles of management, other styles of work, maybe not toxic, but far more hard driving, were actually the secrets to success? What do you think? Are you just being idealistic and selling these dreams that Accenture and other consulting companies have, or is it actually possible to create such an environment?
I think it's possible, but it's incredibly difficult work, incredibly, and what I will also state more from an employee perspective. I mean, you have choice in terms of not only the role you have. Like I remember giving my, then 14-year-old daughter advice when she asked me what should she do when she grew up. Well, I'm always going to give the advice to anyone I coach or mentor, or anyone who asks or doesn't: follow your passion, do the thing that excites you and brings you great joy. I don't think that that's being idealistic in any way. And so I think we should be creating a culture and environment where we're getting people into the right roles. And then and so that means being much more flexible. You talked about age. So we've got, many CEOs who are operating from a generation ago. So I think there's, giving people opportunity that have had real life lived experience. I'm not going to hire you just because you got your MBA. I want people, that's great, you're well educated, but I want people who've had real life work and life experience. They've worked in different functional areas. They've worked in different parts of the world, right? So you being strategically intentional, that's a phrase I use often. And
strategically intentional.
So it's tough. And then, but there's also a significant amount of work again in creating that culture environment. Find the, people to go into the right roles that, that they enjoy, build their skills for future because it's changing so quickly, and do so with stated purpose around what products and services you're doing in the world and what, and the kind of environment you want to create, but then hold people accountable. And so this is, for me, it's showing up in a way where I am modeling the behaviors, the actions, and the language that I expect others to have around me, and for the type of leader I would actually want to work for. So is it idealistic? No, not necessarily, but there's significant amount of like strategy and intentionality behind every facet of the organization that you need to develop and be incredibly mindful about to be successful.
Which I intended with Victoria Pelletier, a consultant at Accenture on transformational leadership, transformation of organizations. She's a incredibly passionate author and speaker, someone that talks about issues about organizational structure and organizational change and leadership on a very frequent basis. It's a real pleasure to have you. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.